Welcome to the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, U.S.-Russia military tensions over Syria peak in eastern Mediterranean. Soleimani masses strike force in the west against U.S.-Israel-Syria offensive. Hezbollah builds mock Israeli villages to train invasion squads. U.S. ends funding for UNRWA and its Palestinian projects. And now to our top headlines. Russia is gearing up for the next step in its intervention in the war in Syria, a joint offensive with Syria and Iran to capture Idlib. Two senior U.S. envoys, Special Representative for Syrian Engagement James Jeffrey and Special Envoy for Syria Joel Rayburn, met on Sunday in Jerusalem to follow up on U.S. President Trump's decision to challenge Russian and Iranian strategy in Syria by forcing them to abandon the Idlib offensive. On Saturday night, explosions were reported at the Meza Air Base in Damascus following a missile attack. Russia and the U.S. have been assembling naval, air, and special forces, raising war tensions to peak levels. Russia has deployed 26 warships and 30 aircraft vehicles for an 8-day sea and air exercise launched in the eastern Mediterranean. The drills are taking place between the Syrian coast and Cyprus, and the Air Force taking part in the exercise includes strategic bombers, anti-submarine warfare planes, and fighter bombers. The nuclear submarine that entered the Mediterranean on Saturday is armed with a variety of cruise missiles for sea and ground targets. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had this to say at a news conference on Friday.
Прежде всего это касается законных властей Сирии, которые имеют полное право обеспечивать свой суверенитет и изгонять, и ликвидировать террористическую угрозу на своей территории. В этом сейчас главная проблема, которая связана с Идлибом. В этом районе, в этой зоне деэскалации, как она была объявлена, должно быть размежевание вооруженной оппозиции, готовой к диалогу с правительством, от террористов Джабхата Нусры.
The Russian Defense Ministry stated that Syrian rebels in Idlib were gearing up to stage a false chemical weapons attack against civilians in order to put the blame on Damascus and give the U.S. and its allies a reason for a strike against Syria. Syrian Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallem had this to say about the attack.
قرار القيادة السورية هو مكافحة جبهة النصرة في إدلب مهما كان التضحيات، ونحن نقول أن الأولوية للمصالحات المحلية التي قمنا بها في مناطق عديدة من سوريا. نحن جاهزون لبذل كل جهد ممكن لتفادي إصابات بين المدنيين.
The UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, warned that miscalculations may occur, leading to an unforeseen escalation.
There is a perfect storm based on warnings, counter-warnings, which is gathering around and due to the dilemma, which is a true dilemma, on how to defeat terrorists in Idlib and at the same time avoid affecting a huge number of civilians. So while we are aware that efforts and discussions are taking place to avoid the worst-case scenario, one cannot ignore that miscalculations may indeed occur, leading to unforeseen escalations, and we are all very much concerned. We already went through that in the past, and we need to make sure that this will not happen again.
Russia, Iran, Syria, and Hamas have launched a series of steps to counter the U.S.-Israeli plan to hit Iranian military targets in Syria. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton finalized this plan during his trip to Jerusalem 2 weeks ago.
Iran obviously had a strategic plan to create an arc of control from Iran through the Shia areas of Iraq into Syria, linking up with Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's not something that we want to see. So we're still working through that. Every time Iran has brought missiles or other threatening weapons into Syria in recent months, Israel has struck those targets. I think that's a legitimate act of self-defense on the part of Israel.
The plan is to strike Iran's Al-Quds brigades and allied Shiite militia forces in Syria and western Iraq. The U.S. and Israel agreed to provide air and military cover for their Syrian operations, which began 2 weeks ago when unidentified warplanes bombed an Iraqi Hezbollah convoy on the Syrian-Iraqi highway. Iran, Syria, and Hamas, backed by Russia, have created a plan to counter the U.S. and Israel. Iranian Defense Minister Amir Hatami met with Syrian leader Bashar Assad, ready to sign an expanded military cooperation agreement. Iran will increase its military holdings on Syria and will receive Russian military backing. Tehran and Damascus will retaliate against U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran's Al-Quds and Shiite militia forces, overseen by Al-Quds chief General Qasem Soleimani. They will target U.S. military forces east of the Euphrates River and IDF forces at the Golan border. Iran and Syria have signed a new military pact to establish 3 Iranian bases in Syria. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu warned Israel's enemies that Israel has the means to destroy them.
צה"ל יוסיף לפעול במלוא הנחישות ובמלוא העוצמה נגד ניסיונותיה של איראן להציב כוחות ומערכות נשק מתקדמות בסוריה, ושום הסכם בין סוריה ואיראן לא ירתיע אותנו. וגם שום איום לא ירתיע אותנו. מי שמאיים עלינו בכליה מעמיד עצמו בסכנה דומה, ובכל מקרה הוא לא ישיג את מטרתו. התהליך הזה של נורמליזציה של מדינות מרכזיות בעולם הערבי עם מדינת ישראל החזקה מתרחש לנגד עינינו בממדים שאי אפשר היה לדמיין אותם לפני שנים אחדות, תהליך שטומן בחובו תקווה בסופו של דבר להשלמת מעגל השלום.
On Friday, Iran said it supplied allied Iraqi Shiite militias with missiles that fire up to 700 kilometers, and Soleimani has put a large force in Anbar. U.S. and Israeli allies in the region are now being threatened by missiles from Iraq. Debka File military sources state that since 2016, this militia has been receiving ground-to-ground missiles, but the range has been no more than 300 kilometers. On Thursday, Hamas leaders claim that the Palestinians have rockets capable of hitting Tel Aviv. Debka File reports that Hamas has been attempting to showcase the collaboration between Gaza's Palestinian rulers and Tehran. Several mock Israeli villages have been built on the Lebanese-Syrian border and are being used to train Hezbollah special forces in invasion tactics. They've copied the mock Lebanese villages set up by the IDF on the Golan to prepare for another war against the Lebanese Hezbollah. The Hezbollah villages are being used as bases on the Syrian borders and holding grounds for Nasrallah's forces. In addition, these mock villages are also training grounds for Hezbollah fighters. The Hezbollah chief has reportedly withdrawn 4,000 combatants, which is half the strength he originally deployed, to help the Syrian army put an end to the rebellion against the Assad regime. Many are heading home after receiving orders to leave the Syrian towns. Some have been restationed on the Syrian-Lebanese borders. The Hezbollah military evacuation from Syria could be a facade to cover up Nasrallah's motives. He's possibly establishing a Western front to support Iran against a potential Israeli or U.S. assault against Iran in Syria, in keeping with Al-Quds chief General Qasem Soleimani's three-front strategy from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon. In a Euronews exclusive interview with Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri, he discusses his views on Hezbollah.
We have political differences. Hezbollah knows that, and I know that. They will never accept my policies vis-a-vis, the Gulf and I will never accept their policy vis-a-vis Iran and other stuff. But it does not mean that we should stop the country from functioning. What I'm trying to reach is, yes, we will always have these differences, and we will always quarrel about them. But what do? Do we focus on that, or do we focus on, we say, we put it on a dialogue table, we will talk about it calmly and see what are the solutions and how do we solve these issues. And then at the same time we bring, because what brings us together is far more that separates us.
The U.S. U.S. State Department has confirmed that the U.S. will stop funding UNRWA, which they state is an irredeemably flawed organization. Their decision has been met with Palestinian outrage. In a press statement, spokesperson for U.S. Department of State Heather Nauert had this to say. The administration has carefully reviewed the issue and determined that the United States will not make additional contributions to UNRWA. When we made a U.S. contribution of $60 million in January, we made it clear that the United States was no longer willing to shoulder the very disproportionate share of the burden of UNRWA's costs that we had assumed for many years. Several countries, including Jordan, Egypt, Sweden, Qatar, and the UAE, have shown leadership in addressing this problem, but the overall international response has not been sufficient. Until now, the U.S. contributed $450 million a year, alongside Germany's $175 million and Saudi Arabia's $150 million. UNRWA chief spokesman Chris Gunness had this to say in response to the decision.
It's a deeply regrettable decision because, make no mistake, some of the most disadvantaged, marginalised and vulnerable people on this planet are likely to suffer. 526,000 children who receive an education every day from UNRWA, 1.7 million food insecure people, 1 million of whom are in Gaza, 3.5 million people who come to our primary health clinics for medical attention. They are the people who are most likely to suffer because of this highly regrettable decision.
Trump administration envoys Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt have stated that refugee status is not hereditary under international law. They proposed, instead of funding UNRWA, to give the donations to host countries to absorb the refugees as citizens, rather than allowing the refugee issue to be a way to prevent peace. Currently, there are over 730,000 Jordanians currently registered as Palestinian refugees. Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi had this to say about the funding cut.
UNRWA is a humanitarian issue on that side. UNRWA is also a political issue. Maintaining UNRWA is maintaining the international commitment inherent in international law. We do believe in the concept of burden sharing, that everybody else in the international community needs to step up and pay their share to the refugees, but we are certainly very cognizant of the extremely dangerous consequences of failing UNRWA and not enabling it to go forward.
Meanwhile, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed optimism for the U.S. decision.
I suggest a gradual conversion of all funds going to UNRWA to other agencies that deal with the question of refugees and actually have criteria. This will not have negative effects. It will have positive effects, because the perpetuation of the dream of bringing the descendants of refugees back to Jaffa is what sustains this conflict.
With us to discuss this is David Bedin, director of the Israel Resource News Agency at the Center for Near East Policy Research in Jerusalem. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So what are the real Palestinian refugees figures compared to the inflated ones?
There's two figures here. One are the people who left in 48, the ones who are amongst the people from 48. That's about 20,000. And the rest is about 5 million who are counted as descendants of the people who left in 48.
Which refugee groups are most affected, Gaza, Lebanon, or Jordan?
At this point, the ones most affected are Gaza, Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem.
Which Arab host countries have absorbed the refugees and given them civil status?
There's only one country that's given civil status to the Arab refugees, and that's Jordan. They are the Arab refugees in Jordan are full-fledged citizens of Jordan.
Do any Arab governments still hope the right of return in peace talks will help them get the Palestinians out?
Let's be very clear about it. Something. This is the focus. The focus of all Arab points of view at this point is the right of return. All Arab countries and the PLO and the Arab League push the issue of right of return as a prime issue that they do not want to get rid of. Not only that, but it's become the right of return by force of arms. So it becomes a lethal right of return.
Why have these Arab countries enforced this?
Well, look, it's a way of continuing the war. The 1948 war was not resolved. It was only an armistice. It's hard for people to understand that the war continues to this day. The Oslo process did not stop the war. It wasn't even ratified by the PLO. And the PLO covenant, which enforces and and sanctifies the idea of right of return was never canceled. Therefore, it continues. The war continues. And this is a way of the war.
And what do you think the process will be moving forward?
Unfortunately, the process will be that, and we saw it this summer, that the children from the Arab refugee camps, from the UNRWA refugee camps, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency camps, have been recruited into a massive militia. And the militia is operating out of their schools, out of the UNRWA schools. Ironically, those UNRWA schools are not financed through Iran, but financed by 67 countries, most of which are Western democratic countries. And these are the people, these are the factors that are pushing it. Only yesterday, we received a letter from the British government. My staff asked the British government, would you consider stopping the military training in the UNRWA schools? And the answer is, we have ways of overseeing what's going on in UNRWA. That's it. In other words, this is the third letter we'd sent to the Brits, and that's the response we got.
Why do you think Germany has agreed to continue funding, knowing what UNRWA is teaching in these schools?
One of two possibilities. Either it's been coordinated with the United States, the U.S. would put out and they put out and they'd put in, or the other possibility, which is frightening, is that Germany knows something about Judenrein, and it's a continuation of a essential German anti-Semitic trend, which we hadn't seen yet in this generation. Now we're seeing it. You can't say the Germans don't know. There's 12 German foundations funded through the German government that finance the right of return, this whole school system. Today, we asked the Israel Foreign Ministry, will you ask Germany to not give funds unless they're supervised, unless there is full-fledged transparency? We did not get an answer. Now, this is very interesting to me because the ambassador to Germany, Mr. Yissacharoff, Jeremy Yissacharoff, is very close to Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu wants to ask Mr. Yissacharoff to stop German funds, or at least to condition German funds to UNRWA. He can do so.
So essentially, some of them are very aware of the anti-Semitic sentiments.
They are all aware of it. I thank Sharon Heskel, who is a member of Knesset, chairperson of the Knesset lobby for UNRWA reform, for making sure that all of the donors to UNRWA have been invited to the Knesset to see the curriculum, to see what's going on, and to see the films that we've made. So no one can say they don't know.
I see. And do you think it's possible for UNRWA to change the anti-Semitic sentiments in the textbooks?
Only if the donor nations demand a change. If the donor demand, the Baal Habayit, the people who will determine what happens with UNRWA, is not the United Nations, which gives no money to UNRWA. The UNRWA money comes to the donor nations. If the donor nations assert themselves, we're going to see a change. That's why it's so important that people who are residents of foreign nations that contribute to UNRWA, we have the contributors listed on our website, IsraelBehindTheNews.com. Ask your nation, why are you giving funds that are not being supervised, that are not being challenged, that are going for such an education system? UNRWA is not an independent entity. It's dependent on the donor countries. And if the donor countries assert themselves, we're going to see a change.
Why do you think the U.S. has been so lenient up until now with what they're teaching in these schools?
Until now, there was a laissez-faire attitude. We do know that the Saudi Arabia, which has become a major, suddenly has become a major contributor to UNRWA, has a very big influence on U.S. foreign policy. But that laissez-faire attitude was more or less a patronizing and paternalistic attitude of the Jews. Don't bother us. You know, we're doing so many things for you, and leave us alone. This has been going on since the Reagan administration through the Obama administration. We'll see what happens now under the Trump administration, if what Trump has done to cut off the aid will be a precedent, or he'll be acting as a Lone Ranger.
How do you think this right of return issue will impact the peace process?
It will. First of all, I don't think there's a peace process. There are negotiations going on. But again, this is the slogan of the armed struggle. You're going to see in the new school year riots which will be militarily oriented. The schools, the UNRWA schools, are weapons caches in all the schools in Gaza. There's no demand to take the arms out of those schools, and the children are going to be using them. Whether it's going to be all the children, some of the children, a few of the children, we don't know. We do know that when a child is inspired by their school books. This is the role model of Dalal al-Mughrabi, who carried out a massacre in 1978, and she murdered 38 people. And this is a lesson plan of a brand new school book being used in UNRWA. fifth grade school book, a seemingly innocuous school book. If out of the 500,000 children learning this school book today, if 1% is inspired, we're in trouble.
Wow. Well, that's David Bedin. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you.
And now for a roundup of this week's regional stories you may have missed, the news in brief. The Israeli humanitarian volunteer-run organization Zaka, which specializes in recovery missions throughout the world, recently facilitated an IDF command search and rescue training course for commanders in the U.S., France, Guatemala, and Zimbabwe. The mission focused on natural disasters, building collapses, and other incidents with high death tolls. The commanders learned rescue and recovery techniques, emergency rescue medicine, and population intelligence. Zaka has trained 1,000 volunteers in 48 units around the world to be first responders in their countries. Israeli professor Yinon Ben-Neria at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's Faculty of Medicine has developed a new drug which cures acute myeloid leukemia, which is one of the most aggressive forms of cancer. This new drug attacks several leukemic proteins, which prevents the leukemia cells from activating other proteins that can evade the therapy. It also works to wipe out leukemia stem cells. These cells have been the primary obstacle so far in finding a cure for acute leukemia. That's all for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week with more exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Be sure to check out our Facebook page at Israel English News and our website, iltv.tv. I'm Yael Shir. Thanks for watching.